Under Vex'Tora of the Galactic Survival Assessment Committee. Subject species human. Location Kratos 9, colloquially labeled Frozen Hell Mission Objective Standard Multi-Species Survival Assessment. Commander Vex'Tora paused the recording device and sighed dramatically, his 4 nostrils flaring in poorly concealed disdain. The bluish-purple scales on his neck bristled slightly as he turned to face his subordinates. Can someone, anyone, explain to me why we have a human participating in this year's assessment? Did we not establish after the incident on Magnus Prime that these creatures are simply too fragile? Vex'Tora's voice carried that special tone reserved for bureaucratic nightmares and particularly stubborn stains. Lieutenant K. Lore, a willowy Sentian with silvery skin that reflected the harsh lighting of the observation deck, cleared her throat. Central Command insisted, sir. Apparently, their diplomatic corps threatened to withdraw support for the Galactic Trade Agreement unless we allowed at least one human to participate in this cycle's assessment. Politics. Vex'Tora spat the word like it was a piece of spoiled fruit. Hey, as if this pitiful creature will last more than a rotation on Kratos 9. He gestured with 3 of his 7 appendages toward the viewing screen, where a lone human female was checking her equipment with methodical precision. What was her designation again? Asked Medical Officer Zrill, his compound eyes blinking in rapid succession as he pulled up the human's file on his datapad. Jackson. Morgan Jackson, replied Science Officer Thrix, her feathery antennae twitching with interest. And I must advise caution in our assessment, Commander. My preliminary research indicates humans have surprising adaptive capabilities in extreme environments. Vex'Tora erupted in a barking laugh that made everyone on the bridge flinch. Adaptive capabilities. Did you see what happened when the Draconian ambassador accidentally exhaled methane near their delegation? 3 of them collapsed from mere respiratory irritation. This, he pointed at the screen again, is their idea of a survivalist. Morgan Jackson was now securing the last of her supply packs, seemingly unaware of the alien eyes scrutinizing her every move. Unlike the other participants from more respected species, she had been allotted the standard survival kit and nothing more. Standard, of course, meant suitable for the average galactic citizen, which Morgan most certainly was not. I've got 500 credits that say she activates her emergency beacon within the first 12 hours, wagered Officer Krell, the navigation specialist, whose species evolved on a planet with triple the gravity of Earth. I'll take that bet and give her 24, countered K. Lore, who had at least read the human's file thoroughly. It says here she was part of something called Special Forces Arctic Survival Training apparently. That's relevant. Vex'Tora snorted derisively. Arctic? Kratos 9 makes their Arctic look like a pleasant spring day on Relvia. The atmospheric composition alone will make her lungs burn after a few hours of exposure. The entire crew fell silent as the human on screen suddenly looked up, almost as if she could hear them. Morgan Jackson's eyes, a disconcerting shade of green that reminded Vex'Tora of certain toxic elements, seemed to stare directly into the hidden camera. Then, inexplicably, she smiled and gave what the aliens recognized as a thumbs-up gesture. Is she mocking us? Zrill asked, genuinely confused. Thrix tilted her head. Perhaps it's a cultural gesture of confidence. It's irrelevant what it is. Vex'Tora dismissed with a wave. Prepare the drop pods. All participants deploy in 30 minutes. Make sure the human understands that using the emergency beacon constitutes immediate failure and extraction. As the crew scattered to their stations, Vex'Tora couldn't help but take one more look at the human. There was something in her posture, a strange calmness that momentarily gave the commander pause, but he quickly dismissed the thought. After all, how could a species that required constant temperature regulation, that couldn't even breathe properly in slightly altered atmospheric conditions, possibly survive on a planet nicknamed Frozen Hell? This should be entertaining, at least he muttered to himself, unaware of just how entertaining it would truly become. The drop pod screeched through Kratos 9's atmosphere, leaving fiery trails that quickly dissipated in the planet's caustic, frigid air. Inside her cramped pod, Morgan Jackson braced herself against the violent shaking, her expression unnervingly calm compared to the panicked gasps and prayers emanating from the communication channel shared by all participants. Atmospheric entry complete. Surface temperatures registering at -123 degrees Celsius. Wind speeds at 87 kilometers per hour. Methane nitrogen mix with trace elements of hydrogen sulfide. Have a pleasant stay. The automated announcement ended with what could only be described as synthetic sarcasm, programmed by some twisted Vexillian software engineer who clearly enjoyed their job too much. "They've placed us deliberately far from each other," Morgan muttered, studying the tactical display showing the landing coordinates of all 12 participants. "And of course they've given me the spot furthest from any geological features that might provide natural shelter. How predictable." 10 kilometers above the surface, the pod's outer shell began peeling away. Morgan felt the first bite of Kratos 9's atmosphere, even through the pod's insulation. It was like nothing she'd experienced before, a cold so intense it seemed to burn. Commander Vex'Tora's voice crackled through the communication system one final time. "Attention. Survival assessment participants. The rules are simple. Survive for 7 planetary rotations, approximately 12 standard galactic days. Emergency beacons are provided, but activation equals immediate disqualification. Any questions?" His tone suggested he neither expected nor wanted any. "Yeah," Morgan replied, knowing full well everyone could hear her. "Do we get bonus points for making this actually enjoyable, or is misery part of the assessment criteria?" The channel filled with confused murmurs from the alien participants, while Vex'Tora's annoyed huff was clearly audible. "Participant Jackson, this is not a recreational activity. It is a serious evaluation of—" "Got it. Misery it is," she interrupted, grinning as the commander growled in frustration. The surface rushed up to meet Morgan's pod. Impact compensation systems fired milliseconds before touchdown, but it still felt like being hit by a truck. The pod hissed open, and Morgan's first breath of Kratos 9's atmosphere felt like inhaling liquid nitrogen laced with glass shards. "Gah!" Holy, she quickly slapped her specialized breathing apparatus over her face. It wasn't a full environmental suit that would be cheating according to the assessment parameters, but rather a filtration system designed to make the atmosphere marginally less lethal. 200 kilometers above, in the observation vessel, the alien crew watched with varying degrees of interest and skepticism. "Notice how the human immediately requires breathing assistance," noted Vex'Tora smugly. Meanwhile, the Draconian participant, Krelvox, is already establishing his base camp with no supplemental oxygen. To be fair, Science Officer Thrix pointed out, Draconians evolved on a methane-rich planet. They're practically built for this environment. The commander waved away her comment. The Sentian and Vexillian participants are also adapting well, and their home environments are far more temperate. On the surface, Morgan surveyed the bleak landscape of Kratos 9 with a critical eye. Howling winds carried ice crystals sharp enough to cut exposed skin. The horizon was a uniform gray-white, broken only by jagged ice formations that resembled massive teeth protruding from the frozen ground. There was no sign of liquid water, no vegetation, nothing but ice, rock, and the constant screaming of the wind. The emergency beacon weighed heavy in her pocket, a small device that would immediately summon an extraction team. All she had to do was press it, and this nightmare would end. Morgan grinned behind her breathing apparatus. "Now this is what I call a proper challenge," she said to no one in particular, as she began unpacking her minimal gear with practiced efficiency. In the observation vessel, Medical Officer Zrill tilted his head in confusion. "Is she laughing?" "The human appears to be expressing enjoyment." "Impossible," scoffed Vex'Tora. "Their neurological systems must work differently under extreme stress. It's clearly a malfunction of some sort." Yet as they continued watching, Morgan's methodical preparation suggested anything but a malfunction. It appeared that, against all probability, the human might actually have a plan. Survival log entry 2. 4 standard hours since deployment. All non-human participants have established impressive temporary shelters. The Draconian Krelvox has constructed a dome of compressed ice blocks that could withstand a minor avalanche. The Sentian Lyra has deployed a self-expanding thermal tent using secretions from her specialized glands. Most ingenious. The human the human appears to be digging a hole. Ha! Vex'Tora ended his recording with a satisfied chuckle, turning back to the monitoring station where his crew tracked all 12 participants across Kratos 9's frozen wasteland. The massive viewscreen dominated the observation deck, split into sections showing real-time footage from drones discreetly following each survivor. Reddit, where its due Lieutenant K-Lore remarked, her silvery skin reflecting the blue glow of her console. At least the human hasn't activated the emergency beacon yet. Yet being the operative word, Vex'Tora replied, mandibles clicking in amusement. Look at participant Grell NX. His exoskeleton is perfectly adapted for these conditions. Already harvested ice, converted it to drinking water using his thoracic heat exchanger, and established a perimeter of thermal sensors. He gestured to the carapacian's display with undisguised admiration. Officer Krell nodded appreciatively. The Vexillian participant has already tapped into a subterranean gas pocket for fuel. Brilliant adaptation. His 7 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of deep respect in his culture. "And what is our human doing?" Vex'Tora asked rhetorically, zooming in on Morgan's display. "Still, digging." Hole, each word punctuated with growing incredulity. On the frozen surface, Morgan Jackson continued methodically excavating the dense, crystalline ice. Her breathing was controlled despite the labor, the specialized apparatus covering her lower face filtering the toxic atmosphere into something marginally breathable. Sweat froze instantly on her exposed forehead, creating a bizarre icy crown. Standard procedure for extreme cold environments, she muttered to herself, fully aware that the observation team was listening. Dig down, not up. Heat rises, cold sinks. Basic physics that apparently the mighty Galactic Survival Assessment Committee overlooked when designing their superior shelters. In the observation vessel, Science Officer Thrix's antennae twitched with sudden interest. "The human may have a point," she said cautiously. "Our thermal readings indicate the ice 15 meters below the surface is nearly 20 degrees warmer than at surface level." 20 degrees, scoffed Vex'Tora. "That still leaves it at a balmy -103 Celsius. Hardly a tropical paradise." On a neighboring display, the Draconian participant, Krellvox, was addressing his recording device with supreme confidence. A1 assessment: "This environment poses minimal challenge to superior Draconian physiology. My heat exchange bladders are operating at merely 40% capacity. I expect to not only survive but thrive during this assessment." Proving once again why Draconians should be considered the premier species for cold weather colonization efforts. Similar reports came in from the Sentian, Vexillian, and carapacian participants, each brimming with confidence, each meticulously recording their superiority for the official assessment records. Meanwhile, Morgan had stopped digging to take a water break. The liquid in her container was already starting to freeze despite the insulated container. She eyed it critically. "You know," she spoke aloud, knowing her words were being transmitted, "there's an old human saying, 'Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall.' Just thought I'd throw that out there." She smiled enigmatically before returning to her seemingly primitive excavation. Medical Officer Zrill tilted his bulbous head. "Is that a threat? A cultural expression? I cannot determine the intent." "It's irrelevant," babbling Vex'Tora dismissed with a wave of his appendage. "Probably oxygen deprivation affecting her cognitive functions. I give her another 6 hours before that emergency beacon activates." "I don't know," Science Officer Thrix said thoughtfully, her eyes still fixed on Morgan's methodical work. "There's something purposeful about her actions." "Purpose?" Vex'Tora's barking laugh startled several junior officers. "The only purpose I see is digging her own burial pit. Now let's check on the Vexillian. That's how you survive on a frozen hell." As the observation team shifted their attention to the other participants, no one noticed the small smile that appeared on Morgan's face, as if she had heard every word of their dismissive commentary. Survival log. Entry 3. 8 standard hours since deployment. Kratos 9 is entering its night cycle. Surface temperatures have dropped to -157 degrees Celsius. Wind speeds increasing to 112 kilometers per hour. Methane crystals forming in the atmosphere. The condition can only be described as absolutely hilarious for everyone except the human. Vex'Tora's voice carried a note of sadistic glee as he watched the monitoring stations. Night was falling on frozen hell, and the true test was beginning. Even for species adapted to extreme cold, Kratos 9's night cycle presented significant challenges. For a human? It should be impossible. "Status report," he barked, pacing the observation deck with barely contained excitement. Lieutenant Kaylor responded promptly, her fingers dancing across her console. "The Draconian has entered hibernation mode, reducing metabolic functions by 80%. His ice dome is maintaining structural integrity despite increased external pressure from the wind. The Sentian has secreted additional thermal insulation around her shelter," added Officer Krell. Body temperature stable, though she's showing signs of discomfort. The Vexillians' gas heater is operating at maximum capacity, Science Officer Thrix reported. He's consuming more fuel than anticipated but should have sufficient reserves. And our delightful little human Vex'Tora asked, mandibles twitching in anticipation. Thrix hesitated. Unclear. The hole is now approximately 3 meters deep, but our thermal imaging is picking up anomalies. Anomalies? What kind of anomalies? Vex'Tora demanded, suddenly alert. The human appears to have disappeared. Down on the planet's surface, chaos was unfolding in the alien shelters as night descended with merciless ferocity. The wind howled with the voice of a vengeful god, carrying ice particles that struck exposed surfaces like micrometeorites. Inside his supposedly impervious dome, Krelvox was rudely awakened from hibernation by a horrifying cracking sound. A hairline fracture had appeared in his ice structure, allowing knives of wind to slice through his shelter. "This is unexpected," he gasped, his specialized vocabulary failing him as he scrambled to repair the damage with rapidly diminishing body heat. The structural integrity calculations were flawless. Meanwhile, Lyra the Sentient discovered that her secretions, perfectly adapted for her homeworld's cold seasons, were becoming brittle and crystalline in Kratos 9's extreme conditions. Temperature dropping beyond tolerable parameters, she reported tensely into her recorder, wrapping her elongated limbs around herself as her shelter began to disintegrate. Secretion glands freezing, cannot produce additional insulation. This is problematic. The Vexillian Zontar faced a different crisis as his sophisticated gas heater sputtered and died, the fuel line frozen solid despite his preventative measures. "Impossible," he snarled, banging on the apparatus with a multi-jointed appendage. "This technology is rated for temperatures as low as -140. This must be sabotage." Across the frozen wasteland, similar scenes played out in shelter after shelter. Perfect plans crumbled in the face of Kratos 9's nighttime fury. Emergency beacons remained unused, but only because of pride, not comfort. In the observation vessel, the mood had shifted from smug superiority to concerned professionalism. Body temperatures dropping across all participants, Medical Officer Zrill reported, his compound eyes rapidly scanning biological data. The Carapacian's exoskeleton is developing stress fractures from the extreme cold. The Draconians' heat exchange bladders are working at 110% capacity. He risks organ damage if this continues. "Where is the human?" Vex'Tora demanded again, now genuinely perplexed. "How can our sensors not locate her?" "Found her," Kaylor exclaimed suddenly. "Well, she's still in her hole, but she's covered it with something that's interfering with our thermal imaging." The view screen zoomed in on Morgan's excavation site. The hole had evolved into a surprisingly sophisticated structure, less a crude pit and more a carefully engineered entrance to what appeared to be a growing network of tunnels. "What in the 7 moons of Vexilia is she doing?" Vex'Tora whispered, his earlier mockery replaced by reluctant curiosity. On the surface, as the temperature plummeted to levels that should render human flesh solid in seconds, Morgan Jackson sat cross-legged in her underground chamber, meticulously mapping out a design on a small electronic tablet. Her breath formed icy clouds even through her filtration device, but her hands remained steady. Around her, the walls of her excavation were lined with reflective material salvaged from her drop pod's thermal shielding. And now, she murmured to herself, we wait for the real cold to begin. Then things get interesting. In the observation vessel, Vex'Tora's expression darkened. "I don't like interesting," he growled. "Especially not from a species that should be failing spectacularly right now." Survival log. Entry 4. 16 standard hours since deployment. Dawn cycle beginning on Kratos 9. Surface temperatures rising to a balmy -134 degrees Celsius. 3 participants have activated emergency beacons during the night. I repeat, 3 participants have failed already. The Sentian, the Morphex, and the Wait Not the Human. How is this possible? Commander Vex'Tora's voice had lost its smug confidence, replaced by a combination of professional concern and personal indignation. He slammed his recording device down on the console, causing several junior officers to flinch. "Show me the human again," he demanded, stalking toward the main view screen. "And someone explain to me why our most sophisticated monitoring equipment can't properly track one primitive mammal." Science Officer Thrix adjusted the settings, frowning as she worked. The interference appears to be deliberate, Commander. She's using the metallic components from her survival kit to create a rudimentary Faraday cage effect, disrupting our thermal imaging. A what? Hey, that's actually quite ingenious, Vex'Tora admitted reluctantly. But why? Unknown, replied Thrix, her antennae twitching with scientific curiosity. But look at this. The view screen shifted to show Morgan's excavation site from above. What had started as a simple hole had transformed overnight. A small entrance tunnel now led to what appeared to be a central chamber, with additional tunnels branching off in 3 directions. Strange metallic components had been arranged in specific patterns throughout the structure. She's building something, Lieutenant Kaylor observed, stating the obvious but unable to help herself. Something complex. Well, I can see that, snapped Vex'Tora. But what? And more importantly, how is she surviving these temperatures? Her species freezes to death at temperatures considerably warmer than this. Down on the surface, Morgan Jackson was hard at work, her movements quick and purposeful, despite the environmental suit she now wore a necessity when venturing outside her growing underground network. She had excavated several large blocks of ice, which she was carefully arranging around what appeared to be a makeshift heat exchanger. Basic thermodynamics, she explained conversationally to the hidden drones she knew were watching. Ice is actually an excellent insulator when used correctly. And this particular ice? Fascinating molecular structure, almost crystalline, refracts heat in predictable patterns if you align the crystal facets properly. In the observation vessel, the alien crew watched in bewildered silence as Morgan continued her explanation, sounding more like a scientist giving a lecture than someone fighting for survival on a planet designed to kill her. You see, your standard galactic survival kits are designed with a one-size-fits-all mentality, Morgan continued, her breath forming icy clouds that were immediately whipped away by the howling wind. But if you disassemble the components and repurpose them, she held up what had once been an emergency beacon's power core, now modified into something unrecognizable. Is she talking to us? Medical Officer Zrill asked, genuinely confused. Of course she is, Vex'Tora growled. She knows we're watching. She's putting on a show. Meanwhile, on another part of the frozen wasteland, the Draconian participant was in serious trouble. Krelvox's ice dome had partially collapsed during the night, exposing him to the elements for crucial minutes before he could effect repairs. His once confident log entries had taken on a distinctly defensive tone. Minor structural anomalies encountered and overcome, he reported stiffly, though the medical readouts told a different story. His core temperature had dropped dangerously, and 2 of his heat exchange bladders showed signs of stress-induced damage. The Vexillian participant, Zontar, was faring little better. His gas heater had eventually restarted, but not before he'd suffered frostbite on 2 of his sensory appendages. The pain was evident in his voice as he made his morning report. Continuing survival operations under suboptimal conditions, he stated tightly, adapting strategies accordingly. Back at Morgan's site, she had disappeared underground again, but not before dragging in her latest creation, a curved reflector panel made from salvaged drop pod materials. Through gaps in her shielding, the observation team caught glimpses of her central chamber. Somehow, impossibly, the walls appeared to be wet. Is that melting ice? Kaylor asked incredulously. How is she generating enough heat to melt ice in these conditions? More importantly, Thrix added, her scientific curiosity fully engaged, she's not just surviving, she's building something deliberate, something engineered. I don't like it, Vex'Tora muttered darkly. Humans aren't supposed to be this adaptable. Sir ventured Officer Krell hesitantly, perhaps we should reconsider our assessment of human capabilities. Vex'Tora's response was a glare so intense that Krell quickly returned his attention to his monitoring station. Down in her expanding ice labyrinth, Morgan smiled as she carefully positioned the reflector panel at precisely the right angle. Phase 1 complete, she announced to no one in particular. Now for the interesting part. Survival log entry 5. 28 standard hours since deployment. Second night cycle approaching on Kratos 9. Meteorological sensors detecting an approaching storm front. Temperatures expected to drop below -170 degrees Celsius. Wind speeds potentially exceeding 140 kilometers per hour. Methane ice precipitation likely. Current participant status: 2 more emergency beacons activated in the past 4 hours. The Carapacian and one of the Vexillians have withdrawn. Only 5 participants remain, including he cannot believe I'm recording this, the human. Commander Vex'Tora's voice had lost all traces of mockery, now sounding professionally concerned and privately astonished. The observation deck had transformed from a place of casual entertainment to a tense command center as the situation on Kratos 9 deteriorated rapidly. Medical status of remaining participants, he demanded, pacing the deck with agitated energy. Medical Officer Zrill's compound eyes flickered with strain as he delivered his report. The Draconian Krelvox is showing signs of severe hypothermia. 3 of his 7 heat exchange bladders have shut down. He's experiencing diminished cognitive function and peripheral nervous damage. The remaining Vexillian Zontar has lost sensation in 2 limbs due to frostbite. His gas heater is functioning at minimal capacity due to fuel conservation measures. The Quarian, Brastix, appears stable, but readings suggest she's entered a state of suspended animation earlier than planned. She may not be able to revive herself without assistance if temperatures continue to drop. And the Nergalian Drath is maintaining core temperature, but at the cost of consuming his emergency ration supply at triple the expected rate. At current consumption levels, he will exhaust all nutrition within 18 hours. And the human Vex'Tora asked, his voice unnaturally quiet. Drill hesitated. The human appears to be cooking a meal, sir. She's what? The main view screen shifted focus to Morgan's underground complex. Through the limited visibility their sensors could achieve, they observed the human sitting cross-legged in what had become an impressively engineered chamber. The walls gleamed with a thin layer of water that somehow wasn't freezing. A small device in the center of the room emitted a soft, pulsing glow, and Morgan Jackson was indeed preparing food, heating a ration pack over what appeared to be a carefully controlled thermal element. This is impossible, Vex'Tora exploded. How is she generating this level of heat? Her survival kit didn't include any heating elements powerful enough for this. It didn't, Science Officer Thrix confirmed, her voice tinged with unmistakable admiration. She's built this, apparently by repurposing the emergency beacon's power core, combined with components from her communications unit and filtration system. But that would require advanced knowledge of thermodynamic principles and electrical engineering, protested Lieutenant K. Lore. Yes, agreed Thrix simply. It would. On the surface, the remaining alien participants were facing a rapidly deteriorating situation. The approaching storm had sent advance winds howling across the frozen landscape, each gust carrying ice particles that scoured exposed surfaces like sandpaper. Krelvox, once the most confident participant, now huddled in his partially collapsed shelter, 7-fingered hands trembling as he recorded what might be his final log entry. The Draconian physiology R remains S superior, he stammered, his proud bearing diminished by uncontrollable shivering. T temporary S setback only. W will P prevail. Zontar the Vexillian had abandoned his sophisticated but now useless gas heater, reverting to the most primitive survival technique in his species' repertoire, self-burial in ice, to create an insulating layer. His movements were sluggish, his normally nimble appendages clumsy with cold, as he packed ice around his torso. Survival Assessment P protocols flawed, he muttered bitterly into his recorder. E environment exceeds S specified parameters. P protest being lodged upon extraction. The Quarian, Brastix, lay motionless in her crystalline cocoon, vital signs barely registering on the monitoring equipment. She had gambled everything on her species' ability to enter deep hibernation, but had miscalculated the temperature at which her specialized biological antifreeze would begin to fail. Meanwhile, in her underground sanctuary, Morgan Jackson was checking readings on a makeshift monitoring system fashioned from salvaged electronics. Her expression was serious but not strained, her movements economical but not desperate. She had created something remarkable, a self-sustaining thermal environment that harvested heat energy from chemical reactions in the ice itself, amplified it through carefully designed reflectors, and circulated it through a network of channels carved into the walls. Storms coming, she observed, glancing upward at the ceiling of her shelter. Barometric pressure dropping faster than expected. Time to activate Phase 2. She reached for what looked like a crude radio transmitter and began adjusting settings with practiced precision. In the observation vessel, Vex'Tora watched in stunned silence, his earlier dismissiveness completely evaporated. "What is Phase 2?" he asked quietly, almost not wanting to know the answer. No one on the observation deck could provide a response. For perhaps the first time in galactic history, a human was not only defying their expectations, she was completely rewriting them. Survival log. Final entry. 48 hours since deployment. Major storm system engulfing 60% of testing zone. 4 additional emergency beacons activated in the last 3 hours. Only participant Jackson the human remains operational, and she appears to be transmitting some kind of signal. Commander Vex'Tora's voice had transformed completely from his initial smug superiority. Now it carried the unmistakable tone of someone witnessing something they never thought possible. The observation deck had fallen silent, all eyes fixed on the main view screen showing the raging storm across Kratos 9's surface. "What kind of signal is she transmitting?" Vex'Tora demanded, mandibles clicking with tension. Lieutenant Kaylor shook her head in bewilderment. "It's not directed at us. It appears to be a short-range broadcast on an unusual frequency, one that penetrates ice structures particularly well." "Show me the Draconians' position," Vex'Tora ordered suddenly, a suspicion forming. The view screen split to show Krellvox's shelter. The once proud Draconian was barely conscious, his magnificent heat exchange bladders shriveled and non-functional, his scaled skin taking on the blue-gray pallor that indicated severe hypothermia for his species. His shelter had all but collapsed around him, leaving him exposed to killing temperatures. His claw was inching toward his emergency beacon when a sound caught his attention. A signal. Faint but clear. "This is Morgan Jackson broadcasting on all frequencies. Storm's getting worse. My shelter has capacity for 3. Transmitting coordinates now. Get here before you freeze or tap out. Your choice." The message repeated in a loop, penetrating even the howling winds of the storm. In the observation vessel, pandemonium erupted. "She can't do that," protested Officer Krell. "Participants are explicitly forbidden from collaborating." "Actually," Science Officer Thrix corrected, rapidly scanning the assessment protocols. "The rules state participants cannot share resources from their initial supply kits. There's no prohibition against sharing subsequently created shelter or tools." Vex'Tora stared at the view screen in disbelief as Krellvox, pride finally overcome by survival instinct, began dragging himself toward Morgan's coordinates. On another screen, Zontar the Vexillian had already begun moving, his partially frostbitten limbs hampering his progress but determination evident in every painful step. "She's rescuing them," Medical Officer Zrill's voice carried genuine confusion. But why? Eliminating competitors would ensure her victory. Apparently, Kaylor observed dryly, humans have different priorities. On the surface, as the storm reached full fury, rendering visibility nearly zero and dropping temperatures to lethal levels, Morgan stood at the entrance to her underground complex. She had reinforced the entry tunnel with ice blocks and salvaged materials, creating a small airlock that minimized heat loss. Now she scanned the whiteout conditions, a rope secured around her waist and anchored inside her shelter. The first figure materialized from the blizzard, Krellvox, barely recognizable under a layer of ice crystals, crawling more than walking. Morgan moved immediately, securing another rope around the Draconian's torso and helping him toward the entrance. "Come on, big guy, heat's this way." Krellvox's voice was barely audible over the storm. "Why help?" "Because we can all pass this test," Morgan replied simply, guiding him through the entrance. "No need for any of us to die proving a point." 20 minutes later, she repeated the rescue for Zontar, whose condition was even worse. One of his limbs had become completely unresponsive, frozen solid in the extreme cold. With both aliens secured in her shelter, Morgan quickly returned to the central chamber, where her ingenious heating system had created an environment that, while not comfortable by human standards, was well above lethal temperatures for all 3 species. The walls gleamed with the thin layer of liquid water that her system maintained, using the phase change between ice and water as an additional heat-regulating mechanism. Krellvox and Zontar huddled near the central heating element, their bodies slowly beginning to recover from the brink of death. Their expressions were a complex mixture of shame, gratitude, and lingering disbelief. In the observation vessel, Commander Vex'Tora watched the scene unfold, with an emotion he couldn't quite name, something between professional admiration and a profound reconsideration of certain deeply held beliefs. Assessment protocol suggests we should extract all participants immediately, medical officer Zrill advised. Conditions have exceeded safety parameters. No, Vex'Tora replied quietly. Let's see how this plays out. The human seems to have things well in hand. As the storm raged outside, Morgan began checking on her alien guests, applying emergency medical treatments from her limited supplies with calm efficiency. "Welcome to Casa Jackson," she said with a smile that transformed her frost-nipped face. "Sorry about the accommodations. It was a bit of a rush job." This concludes official Galactic Survival Assessment Report for Kratos 9 trial. Assessment terminated after 72 standard hours due to extreme conditions exceeding safety parameters. 3 participants survived until extraction. The human, Morgan Jackson, the Draconian, Krelvox, and the Vexillian, Zontar. Final determination pending committee review. Commander Vex'Tora ended the formal recording and slumped back in his command chair, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. The observation deck was quiet, the usual buzz of activity subdued as the crew processed what they had witnessed over the past 3 days. Sir Lieutenant Kaylor broke the silence. Extraction team reports all 3 survivors are safely aboard and receiving medical attention. Good. Vex'Tora nodded, then added, "I want to see them." All 3. 20 minutes later, in the vessel's medical bay, Vex'Tora stood before the survivors with a markedly different demeanor than the smug superiority he had displayed at the mission's outset. Krelvox and Zontar were recovering in specialized medical pods, their conditions stable but requiring significant treatment for cold-related injuries. Morgan Jackson, by contrast, sat on the edge of an examination table, looking remarkably unscathed apart from minor frostbite on her cheeks and the tips of her ears. More surprisingly, she was holding a steaming cup of what the ship's sensors identified as tea, a human beverage she had somehow convinced the medical staff to provide. "Commander," she acknowledged with a casual nod, taking a sip from her cup. "Lovely weather you arranged for us down there. Very bracing." Vex'Tora's mandibles clicked once, the equivalent of clearing his throat. "Participant Jackson, we have some questions." "I bet you do," Morgan replied, blowing gently on her tea. "But before we get to that, how are my roommates doing?" She nodded toward the medical pods containing Krelvox and Zontar. "They will recover fully," Medical Officer Zrill assured her. "Though the Draconian has suffered permanent reduction in heat exchange capacity, his extreme environment exploration days are likely over." "Shame," Morgan murmured. He seemed quite proud of that capability. "You saved their lives," Vex'Tora stated flatly. "At considerable risk to your own. Why?" Morgan shrugged, a curiously human gesture that none of the aliens could properly interpret. It seemed like the right thing to do. Besides, dying alone on an ice planet is one thing. Letting someone else die when you could help, that's something else entirely. Science Officer Thrick stepped forward, her scientific curiosity clearly overwhelming protocol. "Your thermal shelter, how did you manage to create it? The power requirements alone should have been impossible with the equipment provided." Morgan's eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "That was the fun part. Your standard issue emergency beacons have remarkable power cells, very efficient quantum capacitance, much better than anything we've developed on Earth. If you reconfigure the output diodes and couple them with a resonating crystal which handily, your ice planet produces naturally about 2 meters down, you get a self-reinforcing thermal loop." The aliens exchanged glances as Morgan continued her explanation, delving into thermodynamic principles and energy conversion techniques that even Thrick struggled to follow completely. "But none of that was in your survival kit," protested Kaylor. "How did you know about the crystalline structures in Kratos 9's ice formations?" "I didn't. Not specifically," Morgan admitted, finishing her tea. "But I've studied xenogeology. Ice planets tend to form certain predictable crystal structures, especially with methane content. I made an educated guess." "An educated guess," Vex'Tora repeated slowly, as if testing an unfamiliar concept. "Something humans excel at," Morgan said with a smile. "That and improvisation. Your survival kits are remarkably well designed, by the way, just not for humans. We're not naturally adapted to extreme conditions like your species, so we compensate with problem solving and tool use. Been our thing for, about 300,000 years." From his medical pod, Krelvox spoke up, his voice weak but dignity partially restored. The human's shelter was impressive. Primitive in appearance but remarkably effective. The thermal gradient she achieved with minimal resources was unexpected. More than unexpected, added Zontar from his pod. It was theoretically impossible according to standard thermal engineering principles. Morgan laughed a warm, genuine sound that seemed profoundly out of place after the deadly serious environment of Kratos 9. The nice thing about theoretical impossibilities is that they're only impossible until someone does them. Then they're just engineering problems that have been solved. Vex'Tora studied the human carefully, his earlier dismissiveness completely gone. "We have perhaps underestimated your species, Participant Jackson." "Most species do," Morgan replied with a smile that was neither boastful nor resentful, simply matter of fact. "It's actually one of our advantages. Being underestimated gives you room to surprise people." "The assessment committee will want a full debrief," Vex'Tora informed her. "Your unexpected success will generate considerable interest." "Happy to help," Morgan said, then glanced at her empty cup. "But first, any chance of a refill? Making tea in sub-zero conditions is tricky, but doing it properly in a well-equipped galley, that's the real test of civilization, you know." As a bewildered medical assistant hurried to fulfill this strange request, Vex'Tora found himself re-evaluating everything he thought he knew about the supposedly fragile humans. A species that could not only survive but thrive in conditions that should have killed them instantly, that could repurpose advanced technology they barely understood, that would risk their own survival to save competitors, and then sit calmly drinking tea while discussing it all as if it were merely an interesting academic exercise. "Will your report to the assessment committee mention that I broke protocol by assisting the others?" Morgan asked casually. "No," Vex'Tora decided on the spot. "I believe the official report will describe it as demonstrating exceptional resource management and adaptation strategies which, I suspect, will result in a revision of our understanding of human capabilities in the official galactic species database." Morgan's smile widened as she accepted a fresh cup of steaming tea from the assistant. "Well then," she said, raising her cup in what the aliens recognized as a salute to revised understandings. As the aliens awkwardly returned the gesture, Commander Vex'Tora couldn't help but wonder what other surprises these unusual mammals might have in store for the galactic community. One thing seemed certain: he would never again make the mistake of underestimating a human with a problem to solve and limited resources at hand. Especially one who could make tea in literal hell.